Hello and welcome back. Our guest today is Alan Smale, whose newest book, Eagle and Empire from Random House, is in bookstores now. Alan, welcome back.
Thank you for having me back again.
So it's been a little over 2 years now. And Eagle and Empire is the third book in the Clash of Eagles trilogy that we discussed when the first book came out, Clash of Eagles. And we, of course, missed Eagle in Exile, the second novel. And so we're now here to kind of round things out at the back end of this arc. First of all, congratulations. That's a Herculean task, writing 3 novels and telling a long story like this, especially one as complicated and with as many characters and twists and turns as you've served up to us over the last several years.
Yes. Being a numbers guy, I had to go back and figure it all out, and I figured out that it's close to 500,000 words, and I have over 100 speaking characters in the books. Even though the books, of course, concentrate on a fairly small cast of characters, there's a large number of other people who come in and out.
And quite honestly, one of the things I like about that is a large number of these, I guess you would normally term them tangential characters, come across as real human beings and have a solid place as you walk through the story. I find that very enjoyable.
Oh, good.
Now, in the first book, The Clash of Eagles, we were talking about a Rome that had not collapsed, where the terrible 3rd century, the century of chaos that laid the seeds and destroyed the basic underpinnings of the empire and the state, opened it up to predation and eventually collapse in the West. And you had posited a solid Roman Empire that still existed, was still vibrant, was still strong, and was in the 12th century actually exploring North America, which they were terming Hespera.
Nova Hesperia.
Nova Hesperia. And that is where we meet our protagonist, Gaius Publius Marcellinus, Gaius Publius Marcellinus, who is a praetor leading a legion and walking his way into what is eventual destruction at Cahokia, the home of one of the mound building cultures, which has a few twists in terms of its technology for the time that allows them to defeat a slightly understrength Roman legion. And then we go from here. You've got Gaius essentially being our point of view for the entire length of the story. And there were a number of, and we'll talk a little bit about the setup. The first book, he comes to Cahokia, he introduces some of the Roman concepts and some of the Roman technology to the mound people. He befriends a large number of them, including some of the younger people who become essentially the translators for him, teaching him the Cahokian and basically him teaching them Latin so that they have an understanding, because by the time the first book was finished, he had a great sympathy for Cahokia and feared that when Rome came in the second wave, that if they weren't properly prepared for it and able to present themselves as a viable ally, they would simply be destroyed. And then we go to the second book, and some of the actions he's taken have resulted in him being banned from Cahokia. And a series of developments allow us to see the other tribes in North America and the other nations in North America. And by the end of that second book, they have come together in kind of a loose alliance, at least several of the tribes, for the Hesperan League. And we all of a sudden at the back end of the book are introduced to Hadrianus III, the Emperor of Rome, who somehow has ended up on the Mississippi Delta for a reason that we find out at the end of that book, and that drives this entire third novel. And then you introduce us to the Mongol horde. Is there no machine of slaughter you won't place in North America to drive a story?
I suppose not, no. I mean, one of the great thrills of writing these books was bringing together these disparate cultures. The books are based in the early 13th century. They start in 1218 AD, and that was the time when the Mississippian culture, when the mound building culture was at its height. And you had this great civilization that actually formed cities and towns and villages, all based around mounds, up and down the Mississippi and up and down the Ohio Valley. And so that was really the point where I started thinking about these books. And then, of course, you have what's happening in Europe at the same time is that Rome has been resisting the Mongol Empire all of this time and pushing them back. And so now Rome is moving into North America. And so essentially the Mongol Empire, which has now taken over China, the area that we now know as China, in the meantime, is now coming in from the west. And of course, the plains of North America are perfect terrain for the Mongols. It's just what they're used to. It's kind of like the steppes at home. So this is their terrain, even though Rome arrived first. The Mongols do have the advantage on that terrain.
And with prairie grass everywhere, they have fodder for their herds of horses.
Logistically, it works out really well for them.
It does. Nice flat plains once they get over the mountains.
Yes, and that is a kind of stopping point for them for a little while in these books.
Now, there's some elements in these books that I really enjoy, and I think several of them were especially driven home to me in this last one. And one is you get an understanding through the story after you read through it. It isn't pushed at you, it just kind of bleeds in from the sides as to what the life of a 25-year Roman legionnaire was like in terms of the places they ended up going in the course of those 25 years. It's just staggering because when we think of ancient times, we don't think of highly mobile peoples taking longer to get from here to there, but certainly traveling from here to there. I mean, Gaius has been to the Far East. He's been to Africa. He's been to Britain. Mm-hmm. And now he's in Hespera. And you've got some of the others have been in places that you wouldn't normally think of an ancient civilization traveling as a matter of just the normal order of business.
I think this is something that we're realizing. I mean, history progresses just like other academic fields do. And I think this is something that we're now learning and really appreciating more, is that there was much more mobility in the ancient world than we thought. Obviously, it was very difficult to get around. Obviously, there weren't very many people who you would describe as tourists, but certainly in terms of the work of the times, in terms of the traders, and certainly in terms of the armies, they were used to covering long distances and going on these very long campaigns. Some of the legions that are in Nova Hesperia in North America in the books, they've been on the road, they've been on this campaign for many, many years by the time the books finish. But this was by no means remarkable for a Roman legion in the ancient world. They would be out in Europe, in some parts of Asia. They would be traveling for a long period of time, and it was true of other armies, not just Rome's armies as well.
Alexander's army,
yes,
from Greece all the way to India.
Yes, the Carthaginian campaign was huge. That was many, many years. So this was really the lot of an ancient soldier. They would have to go a very long way and spend a lot of time on campaign, and it might be a very long time, if ever, by the time they got back to their home.
Now, you've made a few changes to the life of a Roman soldier.
I have indeed, yes.
You have taken liberties with some of the structures of the command structure, and have incorporated some changes in the structure of the state itself. Mm-hmm. One of the big changes, of course, is that in the old times, Roman soldiers normally couldn't have wives and families.
They often did kind of informally. There were camp followers. There was this little town of people who would follow a legion around. And quite often under those circumstances, effectively the men would have wives. But they weren't really allowed to. It was kind of winked at, but there were no penalties by and large to this kind of activity when you were on campaign, but they weren't formally allowed to have wives. The Roman Empire in my books, they obviously survived for quite a while, longer than it did in our world. A number of things have stayed the same and other things have changed. So the basic functions of Roman society are largely the same, but there has been a gradual evolution in some parts of it. And some of those parts are in how the auxiliaries are meshed in with the main Roman legions. A couple of things about some of the people higher up in the army can take furloughs, and as you mentioned, some of the men can marry.
One of the things that's interesting, we have three different groups here. Mm-hmm. We have the Hesperans, the Native American Indians, and the various tribes. You've got the Blackfoot, you've got the people of the Hand, you've got the Cahokians, you've got the Pawnee.
Yes.
And although they do fight back and forth amongst each other, their organizational structure and their ethos is much different than the other two primary players in this. That's Rome and the Hun, not the Hun, the Horde,
Mongol Horde.
Mongol Horde, is that these two civilizations, a great part of what provides the wealth and the commerce in both of those is conquest. Conquest, expansion, the acquisition of the goods of others to be fed into the ever-hungry mouths of the empire itself. Rome perhaps more developed because it's been there longer, and the horde, the newly emergent force in the world. And basically both of them are, to a greater or less extent, the most successful predators on the planet.
Yes, they're essentially both plunder economies in both cases. And in fact, even though they're desperate enemies, Rome and the Mongols have a lot more in common with each other than they do with the Native Americans. And one of the joys of writing these books was to examine all of the various Native American nations and tribes, because they're all very distinct, of course. They're not just one mass of people. They all have very distinct appearances and clothing and styles of doing things. Some are more warlike than others. And so and they're completely different from the invaders who are coming in from the east and from the west. And so I greatly enjoyed trying to portray that as well as I could, and having strong characters in each of these cultures, and showing how this Hesperian League that eventually grows up amongst the Native American nations and groups in response to the invasions, showing how that's a really kind of uneasy thing. I mean, it's loosely based on the Iroquois, on the 5 tribes of the Haudenosaunee, who did have that kind of, the Iroquois. The League of the Iroquois was kind of the loose model for how the whole of the North American continent ends up going in my books. And so they had this. Essentially,
it's a loose confederation that has agreed not to disagree as often as they have before. And when the continent is threatened, they understand that the threats that are out there are the kind that would require them all to work together to protect themselves as a whole from being subsumed, as some of them were when the Romans first came to the east coast of what is now the U.S.
Yes.
You also put your protagonist, Gaius, through a lot in these 3 books.
That poor man, yes, his body must look terrible by now.
It struck me in this novel when in one of the instances, after he's gotten out of a battle, he makes the comment that they hadn't noticed one of his wounds because it was in the same place of another wound that he had suffered in a previous conflict.
Yes, a Native American healer doesn't spot that wound because she's already fixed that wound on a wound to his leg on a previous occasion. Yes.
It's a testament both to the healer, I suppose, and also to the constitution of a Roman soldier that he can take that kind of a beating.
Although I did like to portray some of the wounds as being, I mean, a lot of it, despite the fact that it's a historical fantasy, I like to be as real and as realistic as possible. So when Marcellinus gets a blow to the head, he does get concussion, and it does affect him for months and years afterwards.
Yes, it did.
It takes him a long time to recover from that. And in the other cases, in the cases of the other wounds, he doesn't just kind of get this horrendous gash to the leg and then leap up and continue fighting. I try to be as realistic as possible.
It's a healing process.
With the wounding as well as the other things.
Now, when you had to have studied Roman military tactics and the tactics of the horde. How did you go about trying to put those two together in a conflict and figure out, or at least project, what possible adjustments either side might have made based upon the tactics of the other?
That took me quite a while and quite a bit of thinking. With the interpersonal relationships in the book, with Gaius's relationships with the various friends he makes amongst the Cahokians and other people in Nova Hesperia, a lot of that was much easier to work out. A lot of the relationships kind of came naturally to me, and a lot of the dialogue just flows out of me and works really well. As far as the battles are concerned, I have to sit down and think about it, and I actually kind of draw things on paper. Like, okay, you have a legion and they have this, and the other side has that. They obviously have a lot of mounted archers, and they have other weaponry, and I kind of work through this in various iterations. So the battles do take me a long time to write because I'm thinking about all of these factors. I obviously have to take into account what I've learned from studying battles from Rome, from the Mongol era, and on into medieval times, because a lot of the medieval battles, a lot of what we learn in medieval battles actually plays strongly into the kind of battles we have in the Clash of Eagles series. And so I'm folding all of that in, but I'm also folding in the additional technologies they have and trying to make it all work together and make it all realistic and gritty and bloody and dusty and smoky. And a lot of these battles are smoky, which is some of the people many of the people are not used to battlefields with smoke pouring all over them. And so that's another thing I have to take into account.
And you also take into account the realities of logistics when supporting an armed force in terms of supply lines, in terms of travel time and the effort that's required to do travel time. Of course, it helps that, at least as far as the Mongols are concerned, labor is not a problem because there are always slaves that you can use until they die, and then just move on and get another slave to take their place. But it does add a heft to it, and it gives you a feeling of the time that it takes, and the time, and the fact that winter is the time when all armies essentially replenish, retrain, refit, and prepare for the spring, which is the time of war.
Yes.
Now, this world is fully realized. I mean, you have a solid backstory for both the Mongols, based upon the history that we know. You have a solid backstory for the new Rome that is still extant. And you have created a loosely allied Hesperan League that now is extant in North America. And you have all of these well-developed characters. And you still have areas that need to be addressed and are hinted to at the back end of the book that will have to be taken care of. Are you planning, now that you've completed this trilogy, are you planning on examining this world again?
I always planned this to be a series of 3 books. When I pitched it to agent and editor, that was how I did it. I always knew there was going to be a big story arc and that arc was going to be concluded at the end of the 3rd book. So this is definitely, when people buy the 3rd book, they know that this is indeed the ending of it, and it's not just going to peter out or lead on. But in terms of future books, there's certainly a lot of room in this world for more stories, both in North America, in Nova Hesperia. There are, as you pointed out, there are threads that could be followed for future stories. And the rest of the world has obviously progressed in the last millennium as well. And I've worked out what happens in other parts of the world, even though it only appears in the appendices to the books rather than in the books themselves.
And I have to compliment you on the appendices. They're very helpful, and they provide and give you an understanding of why the structure of the story and of these various elements within the story are what they are. It really does settle you into it.
And I put those in there because people had a lot of questions for me at conventions, at Comic-Cons and at Worldcon and various places. People would come up and ask me questions, and I would be interested in telling them the answers. And so there are, in all 3 books, there are appendices that go into things in a little more detail than I'm going to go into in the middle of an action-adventure story. But yes, the world is wide. I'll probably write some shorter fiction set in that world, standalone stories, but within the world of Clash of Eagles. I plan to do that at some point, and if sales are good enough, then I'd be perfectly happy to write more books in this universe.
Why, of course. Your publisher would be very happy for you to write more books.
Maybe so, yes. Yeah, so, I would love to do that.
Terrific. Well, Alan, we're almost out of time. Do you have anything in particular that you're working on right now?
Right now, I'm putting together proposals for future books in completely different worlds. I'm not going to say too much about them because things may change at this point, but I'm going to be sticking with the brand, if you like. They're going to be set in the ancient world. We're going to have certain elements of, let's call it, precocious technology, so I'm going to have that combination of the interest of the ancient world civilizations plus new things coming in. I'm hoping it's going to be a book series. At the moment, I'm assuming it's going to be another trilogy. So that's what I'm working on right now, and hopefully in a few more months, I'll have something solid in place.
Well, thank you for giving us at least a thread of hope for future works.
Thanks very much.
Alan, we are out of time, and I am sorry. Thank you so much for coming back and visiting us again. Thank you for Eagle and Empire. It was a lovely read. I really had a great time.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me back.
Thank you. Well, that's it for this edition of Fast Forward. We hope you found something of interest. We hope you come see us again. Until then, this is Sam Shad saying, take care.